Thanks so much. And really wonderful to hear or see everything in the chat and see all those wonderful words and hear all your thoughts, because so many of those are important. I mean, the idea of interconnectedness, not just across space, but through time. You know, as Rinke was saying there, how do we develop a new sense of time? And going back to what Grant was saying, well, one of the cause of that is all about inheritance. In fact, that's in a way all I'm talking about. How do we rethink and reimagine what inheritance might really be? And I'll get into that a bit as I go along, but I'm going to talk for about 20 or 25 minutes before you go out into your breakout rooms. I can also see these amazing things popping up in the chat. Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Buddhist thinker, all sorts of great stuff. And I hope we can get into that. But where do we really begin? Well, I think the place to begin all of this is with what Rinke was saying about the problem of short-termism in society, really, that we all know this, right? We know that, by the way, am I being high spotlighted? Because I can see not myself speaking. I can see somebody else. You can all see me fine. Okay, wait, I'm just going to adjust my screen slightly then. Look, there I am. So yes, where do we begin? We begin with the great tragedy of our times, which is the tyranny of the now. The fact that the present tense dominates everything, that our politicians can't see beyond the next election, businesses can't see beyond the next quarterly report, markets spike, then crash in speculative bubbles, nations sit around international conference tables bickering away while the planet burns and species disappear. And of course, as individuals, you know, we are looking at our phones and we're clicking that buy now button. And I guess one of the problems with the tyranny of the now is, well, you know, we all know that we need more long-term thinking to deal with the challenges of our time, right? We need it to deal with the technological challenges that Irene was mentioning earlier, you know, challenges of the problems of threats from artificial intelligence or bioweapons. We need to plan for the next pandemic that might be on the horizon. We need to tackle wealth inequality and racial injustice, which gets passed on from generation to generation, you know, one of the problematic inheritances. And of course, we need long-term thinking to deal with the global ecological crisis, with climate change, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, and so on. And in a way, there's a kind of paradox here, right? That the need for long-term thinking is incredibly urgent, right? We need it right here, right now. And one of the ways I think about this problem is that I believe we have colonized the future, that we treat the future like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was really nobody there. And it's a bit like the way when Britain colonized Australia in the 18th and 19th century, they drew on a legal doctrine now known as terra nullius, nobody's land. They treated the country, the continent, as if there were no people there. Of course, there was the indigenous population. And I think now we've got not just terra nullius, but the problem of tempus nullius. We treat the future as nobody's time, an uninhabited territory that is ours for the taking. And I think it's quite interesting to try and sort of visualize what this looks like. I'm just going to share my screen now, and you should be able to see there a cartoon, which is based on my book. And there in the room, you can see colonial racism, toxic waste, climate change, and underneath that caption, that's the crap we inherited. That's our crap. We'll just let the grandkids all sort it out. And I think this sums up that colonization problem that we currently face. But it is quite difficult, I have to admit, to connect with those future generations and really to bring them into our minds. And here's an image from my book where I tried to do this. It's called The Scale of Unborn Generations. And in the little green circle of the 7.7 billion of us who are alive today, if we cast our minds back 50,000 years, let's start getting really long term here. Over the last 50,000 years, an estimated 100 billion people have been born and died. But if you go forward 50,000 years, an estimated nearly 7 trillion people will be born. And, in the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born, amongst them all your children and grandchildren and their grandchildren and the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. So there's a real question, I think, about how those future generations are going to judge us for what we did or didn't do when we had the chance. And someone who really thought about this, someone who's really inspired me, is the immunologist Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine back in the 1950s. But in later life, he said that the great question facing our society is this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, he believed that if we were going to tackle the problems of our time, the destruction of the natural world, the threat of nuclear war for him were big issues, we needed to think about how we were going to be judged by future generations. And in particular, he believed we would need to expand our time horizons. So instead of thinking on a scale of seconds, minutes, and hours, we need to think on a scale of decades, centuries, and millennia. And if you look around the world today, there are so many inspiring projects which are all about trying to get us to be good ancestors, trying to help us think long term. Now, you might be thinking of projects that you know about as well, and keep those in your mind, because in a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask you to write some of them in the chat. But let me just introduce a couple of projects which I think really capture the essence of what long-term thinking and being a good ancestor is all about. So here you can see the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is collecting millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker in the Arctic Circle that's designed to last for 1,000 years. So to preserving the world's plant biodiversity, incredibly long-term project in the scientific world. But in the cultural world, there are examples like the 10,000-year clock. This is a slow time clock currently being built inside a limestone mountain in the Texas desert by the Long Now Foundation, where I'm a research fellow. And this clock is designed to stay accurate for 10,000 years. There you can see the pendulum going up. They're still in the middle of making it. It's going to take them at least another 10 years to finish this project. But the idea is that the clock is like a secular altarpiece that you can visit, almost like a pilgrimage you could go on. And to get there, you'll have to hike through the desert. It'll take you a couple of days to get there. And then you walk up steps cut into the mountainside, each of them the equivalent of 1 million years of geological time. Or so in a way, this project, the aim of it is to help us take responsibility for future generations, to help us think about them. And, at this point, having mentioned a couple of projects, you've probably thought of your own projects, which you find inspiring, long-term projects. So what I'd love you to do is just to write quickly in the chat an example or two examples of long-term projects which you find powerful or inspiring, that you connect to in some way, because I would love to know what is going on inside your heads. So let's just see for a moment the kind of things that you come up with. So eco-restoration camps, raising children, that's a long-term project. I'm engaged in that. Jane Goodall's work, of course, with primates, which is about sort of empathy through time, but potentially also through space. Artpeer, I don't know what that means. I wish I spoke Dutch. The World Arctic Archive, great examples. The tiny house movement, that's really interesting in terms of long-term sustainability. Onkolo, the great radioactive waste disposal facility in Finland, which is designed to last for 1,000 years. 100,000 years, actually. All sorts of amazing things coming up. In Redesigning Psychiatry 2040, never heard of that one. I want to find out more about that. Permaculture. So you can see, you're all connected to ideas of long-termism, but in society at large, it's certainly not the dominant value. Short-termism is much more dominant. And there's more coming up in the chat there. We'll come back to some of those things like rewilding, greening the world, frozen arcs. I love all this stuff. But let me now talk a little bit about how are we going to switch more people's minds onto long-termism. And I think the starting point for doing that is looking inside our own brains, right? That, we think of ourselves as short-term creatures driven by immediate rewards and instant gratification. And to a certain extent, that's true. I call it the marshmallow brain. It's that part of our brain which is all about short-term rewards, named after the famous marshmallow test from the 1960s, the psychology test, where kids had a marshmallow put in front of them, and you probably know this, and if they could resist eating it for 15 minutes, they were rewarded with a second marshmallow. And it turned out the majority of kids couldn't resist and snatch the snack. But the marshmallow brain is a flawed test in many ways. And one of the ways is because it ignores another part of our neuroanatomy. And I call that other part this, the acorn brain. The acorn brain lives here in the frontal lobe, particularly a part called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, if you're into neuroscience. That's the bit which focuses on long-term thinking, planning, and strategizing. And it is better developed in human beings than most other creatures. So a chimpanzee, right, will plan ahead a bit. They might get a stick, take off the leaves, and turn it into a tool to stick into a termite hole. But they'll never make a dozen of those tools and set them aside for next week. But that is exactly what a human being will do. You know, we do that kind of planning. That's the acorn brain in action. It's the acorn brain, which enables us to save for our pensions or write song lists for our own funerals, or it's enabled us to build the Great Wall of China or voyage into space. So we need to recognize that there's a struggle going on between the marshmallow and the acorn. You know, do we party today or save for our pensions for tomorrow? Do we upgrade to the latest iPhone or plant a seed in the ground for posterity? And what we really need to do as individuals and as societies, learn how to switch on that acorn brain. And that's really the question. How do we do that? How do we switch on that acorn brain? Well, let me just share my screen again and just show you another diagram from my book, which is I call the Tug of War for Time. And this, I think, is the key for switching on the acorn brain, is to recognize that there are 6 drivers of short-termism, but 6 ways to think long-term. And these 6 ways to think long-term are like a mental toolkit for becoming a good ancestor that we can explore and develop in ourselves. Now, the drivers of short-termism, some of those are very familiar, like digital distraction, political presentism, the way politicians can't see on the next election. Another one there is maybe less familiar, is the idea of the tyranny of the clock. Think of the way clock time has developed over 500 years. Over the last half a millennium, time has been speeding up, in the future disappearing, because the first clocks in medieval Europe in the 14th century used to just chime mostly once an hour or maybe once every 15 minutes. But by 1700, most clocks had minute hands. By 1800, they had second hands. And that's why the clock became the key machine of the Industrial Revolution, keeping the assembly line moving, making workers clock in and clock out, speeding up time. And of course, now we've got nanosecond speed share trading and all that kind of thing. So time has been speeding up. But so we need to think about, okay, how are we going to cultivate the ways to think long term? And I'd like to introduce you, just in this little talk I'm giving here, to just 3 of the ways to think long term: cathedral thinking, intergenerational justice, and developing a legacy mindset. So let's just start with cathedral thinking, which is the idea of engaging in projects with very long time horizons, decades or centuries, certainly projects that go beyond your own career and ideally beyond your own lifetime. You know, Greta Thunberg, of course, have talked about that we need cathedral thinking to deal with the climate crisis, a long-term challenge. Now, cathedral thinking comes in different varieties. You know, if you're thinking in the Netherlands, you're probably already thinking of long-term cathedral projects like, you know, the dikes, you know, developing, and the water boards developing since the 16th century, an incredible kind of long-term cathedral thinking kind of project that the Netherlands and the Low Countries are familiar with. But here are just a few other examples. In the top left-hand corner there, you can see an actual cathedral, in fact, a Lutheran church. This is Ulm Münster in southwest Germany. A great example of a certain kind of cathedral thinking, which is about a project which takes a long time to complete or to finish. So Ulm Münster was begun in 1377 when the citizens of Ulm decided they wanted their own church, but it wasn't finished for more than 500 years. It wasn't finished till 1890. To more than, so, you know, it's almost like the world's longest crowdfunding project, Ulm Münster. So that's one kind of project. On the right, you can see a different kind of cathedral thinking project, which is not so much a project that takes a long time to complete, but one that is designed to last for a long time once it has been made. And the picture you can see there is of the sewers built in London in the 19th century after a famous event called the Great Stink of 1858. And up until that time, raw sewage, raw shit was being put into the River Thames, and the smell and tens of thousands of people were dying of cholera each year and other diseases. And the smell was so bad in 1858 that the smell was coming into the Houses of Parliament, and members of Parliament, the politicians, couldn't even breathe. They were wearing masks, and they finally passed the emergency legislation to build the sewers. And the thing about the sewers is they're still in use today. These sewers built in the 1860s and 1870s. Why are they still in use? Because the chief engineer made them twice as big as they needed to be. So he was looking ahead at least 100 years to what the population would require. And he also used very expensive materials to make it. So this is real long-term cathedral thinking. And in the bottom left corner, I've just got a different kind of example just to remind you that cathedral thinking isn't just about building stuff. It's also about social movements, like the civil rights movement in the United States has taken and is still ongoing at least 50 years to achieve their aims. The same with women's movements around the world, movements for indigenous rights. So social movements, the big ones tend to know on the big issues, they're not going to achieve their aim in months or years. It might take decades or longer. It needs cathedral thinking. Now, all of this stuff I find quite inspiring, and I hope you do too. But it doesn't mean that cathedral thinking is always good for us, because it can be put towards narrow and self-serving ends. Just think that the regime in North Korea wants to do cathedral thinking, passing on power and privilege from one generation to another. Or think of, in the corporate world, a former head of the investment bank, Goldman Sachs, once said, we're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy. Well, that's a really narrow kind of long-term thinking, which isn't to the benefit of everybody in that giant orange circle that I described and showed earlier. So there's a real question of, okay, cathedral thinking is good, but what else do we need? And that takes me on to a second form of thinking long-term, which is the idea of intergenerational justice. What's this all about? Well, the great comedian Groucho Marx once said, why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me? And I think intuitively, that's what a lot of people think and feel. I've got enough problems in my own life today. And intergenerational justice is saying, well, actually, wait a minute, don't we have an obligation to those future generations? I used to be a political scientist and apparently an expert on democracy. It never occurred to me that we have an obligation to future generations, that those future generations are given no political voice or representation. How do we do that? How do we give them a voice in today's decision-making? Well, I think we can find inspiration in the idea of seventh generation decision-making, which comes from Native American communities and other communities. Here's a lovely quote from Chief Oren Lyons from the Haudenosaunee, or sometimes called the Iroquois people. He says this: we are looking ahead is one of our first mandates given us as chiefs to make sure that every decision we make relates to the welfare and well-being of the seventh generation to come. And that's the basis by which we make decisions in council. Will this be to the benefit of the seventh generation? Now, it's a lovely idea, but you might be thinking, okay, how do we put that into practice in fast-moving modern societies in the Netherlands, in the UAE, in Tokyo, wherever? Well, there are organizations around the world, I think of them as time rebels, who are trying to put this kind of thinking into practice, seventh generation thinking. One of them is this amazing legal movement in the United States called Our Children's Trust, what they've done is they filed a landmark lawsuit against the US federal government and several states on behalf of the 21 young people there who are campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. Now, this is one of the most incredible shifts in the history of rights since the French Revolution, the idea of trying to give rights to future people. But we're now living in a world where there's more and more of these legal cases going on, not only in the United States, of course, there's the Ogenda ruling in the Netherlands. And as Irene mentioned in that introduction, just in the last week, the German Constitutional Court has made a ruling talking and using the language of the rights of future generations. It's absolutely incredible. So there's all these movements to get behind, and seventh generation thinking has very much inspired this particular movement, Our Children's Trust, in the United States. So that's one area where there's intergenerational justice coming into play. Here's a different example, also inspired by the Native American seventh generation idea. This is a movement of local government decision-making in Japan called Future Design. And what they do is they invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they typically split them into two groups. Half are told they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these orange ceremonial robes to wear. In fact, I've got one here, if you can see my screen. I've got one there from Yahaba in Japan. And when you're wearing the robe, you're told to imagine yourself as a resident from the year 2060. And it turns out the residents from 2060 come up with much more radical plans for their towns and cities, whether it's healthcare, investment for the long term, or climate change action, all sorts of areas. So why isn't this is a kind of citizens' assembly movement, and these are rising up around the world, in Belgium, in Spain, in Scotland, and other places. So let's try and inject them with this long-termism, using our imagination to think into the future. Well, let me now say something about legacy and that idea of inheritance, which I mentioned earlier and which Grant mentioned, because thinking about our legacies is really fundamental. Because if you think about the legacies that, or the inheritances that we have received from the past, some of them are very positive. You know, we are the inheritors of positive legacies from, you know, the medical discoveries that we still benefit from, like Jonas Salk's discovery of polio, or the cities we still live in. But we're also the inheritors of negative legacies, destructive legacies, legacies of slavery and colonialism and racism that create deep inequities that must now be repaired. Of course, the Netherlands, like Britain, has this history of colonialism. And we're also the inheritors of economies that are structurally addicted to endless growth and fossil fuels that must now be transformed. So we need to think about, well, what legacies are we going to pass on to the next generation? But the challenge is, how do we make a close and emotional connection with those future generations? Because that big orange circle I showed earlier could feel a bit abstract and not really do anything for you. It does something for me. So I'd like to take you on a little bit of an imaginative journey now into the future. And what I'd like you to do now is, actually, the best way to do this, if you can, is to stand up and take a few steps back from your screen, if you can. And so if you could all do that, stand up, or you could do it in your chair, what you like, but try and stand up. I can see a few people on the side there standing up. What I'd like you to do now is just close your eyes. And I would like you to imagine a young person in your life who you really care about. It could be a nephew or niece or child or grandchild. Just picture their face for a moment. And now I'd like you to take a small step forward. And you've now traveled 30 years into the future. Still with your eyes closed, I'd like you to picture their face. 30 years in the future. Think about the joys they're facing, the struggles in their lives. Just hold that thought for a moment. And now I'd like you to take a final step forward. It's now their 90th birthday party. With your eyes closed, still imagine them surrounded by family and friends and loved ones and work colleagues and neighbors. They're 90 years old today. Go and have a look out the window. What kind of world is it out there? And now you come back in and you see that this 90-year-old stands up and is about to give a birthday speech. And suddenly they see a photograph of you, their departed ancestor, over on the table. And they decide to tell the gathered room about something that you did to shape their world for the better, a positive legacy that you left their generation. When you just think for a moment about what they said about you in their speech. And now I'd like you just to open your eyes again, sit back down if you were standing up, and just think that, of course, that little imaginative journey that was developed by the Long Time Project, a fantastic group in London, that imaginative journey can be quite confronting, particularly if you've got a dark vision of the future, but it can also be a way of connecting us with future generations. When I do it, I imagine my daughter, when she's 90, that'll be nearly the year 2100. And I realize that she's not alone in the world. She's surrounded by family and friends, you know, the web of light of people that support her, but also the web of the living world, the air she breathes and the water she drinks. And so I think doing that kind of imagining can help us make that connection. That future of our children or grandchildren isn't science fiction. It's an intimate family fact. And there are lots of, you know, wonderful legacy projects which can help us try and extend and make that connection with the future. Let me just show you one of them, which is a project called Future Library, developed by the Scottish artist Katie Patterson, where every year for 100 years, a famous writer is donating a book which will be kept inside the Future Library until the year 2114, at which point the 100 books will be printed on paper made from 1,000 trees which have been planted in a forest outside Oslo. The first person to donate a book was Margaret Atwood. You can see there, Han Kang, Elif Shafak, other writers have donated since. And Margaret Atwood is never going to meet the readers of her book when it's published. She's never going to see it published in her lifetime. And it raises a question for all of us, I think, about the legacy gifts that we are going to leave the generations of the future. What gift do you want to leave in your own life, in your own work? And ultimately, really, what is this all about? This is about extending our time horizons. It's about getting off those short-term cycles of seconds and minutes and hours, the buy now button, the 24/7 news. It's about trying to connect with those longer cycles of time, which we all can do, the decades, the centuries, millennia, the planting the seeds in the ground, the looking beyond the here and now. And to do that, I think we need to draw on all the different ways of becoming a good ancestor, all of those different mental tools, intergenerational justice, legacy thinking, deep time, one I haven't talked about. There's so much that we can draw upon to use our incredible acorn brains, win that battle against the marshmallow. The marshmallow still matters. I still want to be clicking it now and then and checking what's going on with my life, but let us try and cultivate the acorn brain. If we do that, we will truly become the good ancestors that future generations deserve.